Hey guys, what is up? That's probably not the right picture, but okay. I'll go with it. Hey, Dad. Hey, Mama Three. Hey, Patty. Long time no see. Hey, Cool Gamer. Oh, shit. All right. I can't wait to read this book. It looks so exciting. The Lies They Left Behind. Suitcases from a state hospital attic. Can you imagine? I can just imagine what's in it. Hi, Tina. Hi, Esty. Oh my God, this phone's driving me nuts. I need to turn off all these, like, hey, Kimmy. Oh, I'm sorry you're lonely. We got us, girl. Virtually. All right, am I good? All right, I'm gonna start. So this book is dedicated to the memories of the Willard suitcase owners and to all others who have lived and died in mental institutions. Oh, don't be sorry. I just started. I haven't even started reading it. The literature on the history of our country's treatment of people, it considers MAD, basically consists of two types of books. There are histories that tell of the various medical therapies and types of institutional care that have been employed to treat those with mental and emotional problems over the past 200 years. And then there are a handful of memoirs by current and former patients, nearly all of which raise troubling questions about the humanity of those treatments. The perspective that has always gone missing is an outsider's look, in what manner of a journalistic or historian, at the lives of the individual patients. What are their life stories? How did they end up in the asylum or a mental hospital? How did the treatment change their lives? You like the picture of the woman? I put that because it looks to me like they're either a ghost or screezing. Yeah, it's a new book. Hi, Night Owl. I literally just started reading it. Yeah, it's a new book. Now we have such a book in the lives they left behind. Through years of diligent research, Peter Stastny, of people who spent decades at Willard State Hospital, sorry, Peter Stastny and Darby Penny have uncovered and documented the personal stories of people who spent decades at Willard State Hospital. Where is that, I wonder? Yeah, it does look like a demon. Where the hell is Willard State Hospital? I want to know. New York. It was established on April 8th, 1865. Construction began July 1866, opened 1869, closed in 95. It was demolished. Then it says 1980, main building, current status closed, building style, Kirkbride Plan architects are William H. Wilcox, blah, 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 blah. Located in Willard, New York. Architecture style is Second Empire. In 1853, the site was acquired for the state's first agriculture college. The college on 440 acres of farmland in the town of Ovid. Really, I need to see some images of this. The Maples building. Hold on, I'm going to get this picture out of here. Yeah. Oh, no worries, Tina. This is the Maples building at the Willard State Hospital. There's a lot of photos. Oh my God. It's creepy yet amazing, they say. Yeah, I bet. Is that you, Claire? So Peter Stastny and Darby Penny have uncovered and documented the personal stories of people who spent decades at Willard State Hospital. Theirs is a stunning achievement, for they have written a book that bears witness, and in the most powerful manner possible, to a tragic time. So this is gonna, from what I can imagine, this is gonna be horrible. Oh, I thought you meant the photo outside. That's weird that you say that because I heard that earlier and I didn't know if it was like a puppy or kids, and I couldn't find the source for anything. And it's so windy here. It's like tornado weather. It's really bad. Like I thought it was going to blow up in my front door. It came close. This is a stunning achievement for they have written a book that bears witness, and in the most powerful manner possible to a tragic time. The history of our country's treatment of people with mental and emotional distress is a very troubled one. At the moment of our country's founding, Benjamin Rush and other prominent colonel physicians utilized the modern treatments they'd learned about their studies in England, therapies that were often extremely aggressive. The prevailing thought was that those deemed mad by virtue of the fact that they had lost their reason had descended to the level of a beast. And so English mad doctors had long advised the insane needed to be tamed and weakened. This is all quotes, like it was a demon, maybe. I don't know what the hell it was, but it did scare me, and I can't figure out what it was. Rush bled his patients profusely and kept them tightly bound and in a tranquilizer chair for long hours. This latter treatment hailed for making even the most patient gentle and submissive. Oh my God, it feels like my house is going to blow over. The Quakers reasoned that While they didn't know what caused madness, those who were suffering were still the brethren and could be treated as such. They built a small retreat in the country where they sought to treat their patients with kindness and provide them with shelter, good food, and companionship. Quakersism in Boston, Philadelphia, and other cities soon built similar retreats, and modern historians have concluded that this form of gentle care worked well. More than 50% of the newly insane would be discharged within a year. And in the best long-term study of moral therapy that was ever done, researchers reported that 58% of those so discharged never returned to a hospital again. The success of moral therapy, ironically, led to its downfall. Dorothea Dix, a 19th century reformer from Massachusetts, lobbied late legislators to build state asylums to provide this care to all who needed it. Only once they did, cities and towns began dumping all sorts of people into these facilities. See, I agree with that, and I felt like they did that. Like Dragon Mama said, they would put you in for your monthly thing. Like, can you imagine? You're a woman, you get your period, but because you got your period and you can't have sex with your husband, you have to stay in a mental asylum until you're done. What the fucking fuck? And if you like the same sex, oh my gosh. Elderly people, those with syphilis who had end-stage dementia, and those with incurable neurological disorders joined the newly insane in these mental hospitals, which grew even ever larger and more crowded. Discharge rates naturally fell as this happened, and by the end of the century, moral therapy had come to be seen as a failed therapy, asylum doctors having forgotten how only 50 years later. It was common for the newly insane to recover and to never be rehospitalized. This brings us to the period that is the subject of this book, 1990 to 1950. It is in some ways the darkest period in American history in terms of our treatment of people diagnosed with mental illness. As the 20th century dawned, America was falling under the weight of eugenic conceptions of mental illness. Eugenicists argued that, if the society wanted to prosper, it needed to encourage those with good germ plasm. Those the eugenicists deemed the fittest to breed, those the eugenicists deemed the fittest to breed and to discourage those with bad germ plasm from having offspring. Hey, Faith. Yeah, no one's doing this book yet. Not yet. Those deemed mentally ill were nationally seen as amongst the most unfit, and so eugenicists argued that they should be segregated in mental hospitals. The hospital was no longer seen as a refuge for troubled people, but rather as a place for keeping them away from society during their breeding years, so they would not pass along their bad germ plasm. Oh my God, that is really quite the way to put it there. Eugenicists also tooted the notion that insanity was a single gene disorder, and thus it was hopeless to think an insane person could ever recover. I can't even imagine what was done to these people. Hey, Teresa. As a result of these eugenic beliefs, mental hospital discharge rates plummeted, whereas more than half of the newly diagnosed treated in the early moral therapy asylums would be discharged within a year. Patients in the first half of the 20th century spent decades in state mental hospitals. For instance, a 1931 study of 5,164 first episode patients admitted to New York hospitals from 1909 to 1911 found that over the next 17 years, only 42% were ever just discharged. Oh, I'm just in the forward part to explain what this book's about. I haven't even got into it. The remaining 58% either died in the hospital or were still confined at the end of the period. As a result, the number of people in state hospitals rose from 126,000 in 1900 to 419,000 in 1940. Wow. A person admitted to a state hospital during this period had every reason to fear he or she would never get out. The lives they left behind tells the life stories of 10 of those people. The tragedy of the era is illuminated in this book in a way no statistics ever could. The photos are equally haunting, and together they document a time when those who struggle with their minds, and often for the most common of reasons, loss of a loved one, loss of a job, or the difficulties that came with being an immigrant in a strange land, were locked away in mental hospitals and then forgotten. It is tempting to look back at that era and see only the shameful relics of a distant past. Today, we tell ourselves we are much more humane in our treatment of those with mental health problems, and our therapies are better too. Yet any close examination of our care today should give us pause. The World Health Organization has twice found that schizophrenia outcomes are much, much better in poor countries like India, Nigeria, and Colombia than in the United States and other rich countries. Moreover, the number of psychiatrically disabled people in the United States has increased from 600,000 in 1955 to nearly 6 million. Oh my God. A statistic that shows we still do not have a form of care that truly helps people recover, and even suggests that we are doing something today that may actively prevent recovery. Wow. Perhaps Darby Penny and Peter Stastny will turn their attention to the conundrum next. This book illuminates the tragedy of treatment of those with mental and emotional problems during the first half of the 20th century in a novel in an unforgettable way. Robert Whittaker, author of Mad in America. I will take pictures and put them on my community tab for you guys. But here's an aerial view in the 1980s of the Willard State Hospital. You can probably barely see it. It's black and white. Prologue: Life in the Attic. Oh boy. The sheltered workshop building stands alone on a hill overlooking Seneca Lake next to the empty lot that once held Chapin Hall, the massive central building of Willard State Hospital, New York. When that towering, meandering structure was torn down in 1988, the institution lost its architectural heart, leaving a scattered bunch of buildings that housed nearly 1,000 mental patients, until the state finally decided to abandon the entire facility in 1995. That spring, all remaining patients were distributed to other institutions. Curators and state workers roamed the grounds trying to safeguard anything that might be worth keeping before the buildings were condemned. They scurried from building to building, determined to beat the looming deadline of the demolition crews. Beverly Courtwright and Lisa Hoffman, two local women who worked at Willard, knew the place intimately. They guided Greg Williams, a curator from the New York State Museum, to the spots that offered the most promise for finding important artifacts. Beverly remembered that there was something stashed under the roof of the sheltered workshop building. She led the group up the steep staircase to the attic and then to a door in the partition under pigeon-infested rafters. Once the door was pried open, they were struck by an awesome sight: a beam of sunlight streaming down a central corridor that separated rows of wooden racks tightly filled with suitcases of all shapes and sizes, men's on the left, women's on the right, alphabetized, labeled, and covered by layers of bird droppings, apparently untouched for a great many years. That would be a good find. I would love just to go through it and see what's there, see what's what. Crates, trunks, hundreds of standard suitcases, doctor's bags, and many sheet containers were all neatly arrayed under the watchful eyes of the pigeons, who would come to join the lost souls in their worldly possessions. For Beverly and some others who saw it, this upper room exuded an unearthly air, a hovering presence of hundreds of souls or spirits. To the many people who handled and warmed the items in those bags, before they were packed, who had read the books, written in diaries, and looked into the mirrors they contained. And there's another photo here, but then again, it's black and white, so I will put them on my community tab. Greg Williams, realizing that he had stumbled across a dream of a treasure, called for additional trucks to salvage the luggage. Just keep 10 and throw the rest away, he was told. Fortunately, Craig ignored this order, and within 2 hours, all 427 suitcases. What the heck is that? I don't know who that is. I'm so sorry. Sorry about that. Apparently, I had mail in my mailbox and it was being blown all over the damn place. I don't know how that is because I never get mail. I don't even know what it was. It's gone now. So the neighbor, the little girl, told me. Okay, so fortunately, Greg ignored this order, and within hours, all 427 suitcases were wrapped in plastic and driven to the museum's warehouse. He knew this was a unique historical find, but one that could not be dealt with immediately. Interns and volunteers cataloged items in some of the suitcases over the next 3 years, but the majority of them remained unopened. In 1998, a group of activists, archivists, sorry, and curators, including Greg Williams, met with the officials of the New York State Office of Mental Health to brief them on a 10-year plan to document the history of mental health in the state. Almost as an aside, Craig mentioned the patient's suitcases in the museum's warehouse from the Willard attic that were saved from the destruction when the facility closed in 1995. This is where we, the authors, come in. One person at the meeting, Darby Penny, recognized the potential of this historic fund to shed light on the lives of forgotten mental patients. She was a director of recipient affairs, a position created in the early 1990s to facilitate input from current and former patients about policies and programs. Darby lived in her colleague Peter, sorry, Darby invited her colleague Peter Stastny, a psychiatrist and a documentary filmmaker, to join the project. Peter brought in a photographer, Lisa Rinzeler, to guide the team's visual approach. This collaboration resulted in a major exhibit at the New York State Museum in 2004. Attended by over 600,000 visitors, there's a website, www.suitcaseexhibit.org, a traveling exhibit, and then ultimately this book. I'm going to put the website in here. That's actually pretty cool. No, too many eyes. What the hell? That doesn't even make sense. Ignore that. How do I keep getting an X? All right, I guess that's it. On our first ride up to Willard, catching a view of two lakes, one before us, the other in a rearview mirror, we could never imagine the worlds that would open up behind the fences, walls, and their leather latches. By then, half of the facility had been converted to a boot camp for drug-addicted state prisoners. As we drove onto the grounds, we heard their marching chants in the background. Some buildings were nailed shut, others were still open, housing workers, alcoholics, a daycare center, but no psychiatric patients. Oddly enough, we noticed a group of obvious patients with their medication shuffle and their poor clothing at a campground by the lake. Some of them were former Willard patients who had come here for an outing from Elmira Psychiatric Center, 30 miles to the south, where many Willard patients had been moved when the facility closed. We pulled up to the sheltered workshop building and waited for the woman with the keys. Once again, it was Beverly who took us up to her area. The old freight elevator had been out of service for years. The huge workshop tables, once surrounded by patients packing pens or gluing bags, stood empty in the barren halls. Old calendars, fire extinguishers, last inspected a decade ago, hung on the walls. The staircase was steep. We trudged up with our camera equipment. Breathless and struggling with dust, we arrived at the top. A few suitcases and clothes were strewn next to a window on the east side of the attic, a strange mixture of beauty and neglect. I don't know. Oh my God, that's sad. I was like, I don't know what the hell this is on the side, but it's discarded grave markers in the Willard Cemetery. I don't know if you can see it. Like I said, I will put the pictures. Oh, I gotta get this. I hope you can see it. Nope. Yeah, I suck at this. I'll put the pictures in there. Bending under the little rafters, we reached the door on the partition wall and opened it. It was late afternoon. Snow had fallen through an open latch. Rows of empty racks took up the entire space, still labeled men and women, and lettered A through Z on each side. An old lab coat hung from a nail, a strangely human shell overseeing it all. Haste had left behind several gutted suitcases, broken interiors of steamer trunks with Chinese motifs, their contents spilling onto the floor, mingling with dust and snow, house keys, photographs, earrings, and belts. We spent much time exploring and documenting the place where the suitcase owners had spent their lives, clambered into basements, sculled several other pigeon-infested attics, and toured dozens of abandoned wards. We tried to hit some pins in the hospital bowling alley, timidly trapezed through its morgue, and unearthed discarded old grave markers in the gully behind the burial grounds. But nothing else had anywhere near the potency of that attic. When we brought a bunch of empty suitcases back to recreate the time when they were all stacked there, we realized that the space had been irrevocably violated once that door was opened. The spirits of the suitcase owners had been awakened without their consent, and we felt that we owed them our utmost effort to do them justice. Do you really, Kimmy? That's awesome. The vast museum warehouse in Rotterdam, New York became our operating theater, and where we encountered the suitcases wrapped in dusty sheets of white plastic, multiplied, tagged, and piled high among the antique cars, building facades, agricultural relics, and thousands of other artifacts from New York State's history. Working with a list of names and hospital identification numbers, we went through several hundred containers, separating the empty ones from those that held merely a sewing kit or a pocket knife. There's a photo here. First view of Lawrence Merrick's suitcase, and there's a pair of really old shoes. It looks like a medal. Wow. Our mission was to choose a relatively small number of suitcase owners for the closer study, and we did not want to miss those who left fewer items behind. There were some obvious choices: the 18 pieces of luggage that belonged to one woman and included much of her furnishing, several oversized steamer trunks, footlockers, wardrobes, upright ladies, Saratoga trunks, so named because they could hold enough clothes for an entire summer season, in the resort town of Saratoga Springs, New York, and a good dozen doctor's bags. These drew our attention not just because of their sizes and unusual shapes, but also for their elaborate markings, monograms, and signs of expensive travel. When opened, dense collections of personal items spilled from many of these suitcases, sometimes still in the same position as they were packed, others obviously disturbed during the intervening years. By the time we had gone through all 427 cataloged containers, we chose 25 individuals for further study, either because their belongings called out to us in a loud and clear manner, or because the relatively few items remaining in their trunks hinted at a unique personal traits and backgrounds. This was the case for one embossed leather suitcase containing just a pair of dress shoes, galoshes, shaving utensils, and a belt, which we had passed over it, which had deprived us of the opportunity to discover one of the most compelling stories of the lot. Once we knew who we wanted to focus on, we needed access to their medical records. As part of a research project, we got permission to view the records, which were kept in an abandoned hospital building, contaminated by asbestos and lead paint, requiring us to don protective booties, masks, and gowns. Most of the charts were in several volumes, spanning years of institutionalization, alternately cheerful and grim, sometimes followed by a photo taken in old age. For the first time, we could look into the people's eyes, those who smiled at us, like Mary Leaner, seemed oddly inviting, while others churned our hearts, ravaged, toothless, their glances broken. We were only allowed a few hours with those records, spanning hundreds of hospital years. We copied pages, cut a few words here and there, dementia praecox, indelibly etched on the face sheet of a person's life. Correspondence was attached in the back. There were chart entries in dozens of different scripts, colors, and levels of erudition. Yeah. Hey, Dragon. Medication longs, a sea of initials entered to signify that a dose was given or refused, X-ray reports, the tracings of a beating heart, and post-mortem results. Once we had worked with these files, the hints from the records and the bags began to coalesce into a plan for discovering the suitcase's owners' paths. Hardly anyone had living relatives, and many of their old addresses had been razed by urban renewal. But sometimes we found those long lost places in a similar state, and when their tenants left them behind, like the home of the Sicilian laborer Michael Bastone, on a street corner south of the Ithaca rail yards, surrounded by industrial cast-offs. We were approached by a man in a pickup truck who turned out to be a son of the neighbor who had called the police on Mr. Bastone more than 60 years ago. Or the twin brownstones across the street from St. Joseph Hospital in Syracuse, New York, where Dmitri and Sophia Zarchuk lived and where Sophia died. As we photographed the building, a man emerged from the neighboring house. He was at the Zarchuks' Italian landlady's son. His 88-year-old mother still lived there and remembered a tenant from 1952 as the beautiful young nurse from next door. Sometimes all we found was a grave, like that of the photographer Herman Graham in Mount Oliver Cemetery in Maspeth, Queens, New York, or Ethel Smalls in Trumansburg, New York. We had spent our careers speaking up for living people who got caught up in the mental health system. What possessed us to spend almost a decade in pursuit of the life of the stories of ordinary people who had died many years before, and whose stories would be told largely in our words and not theirs? Why piece together biographies from remnants when they are living people perfectly capable of telling their stories and having them recorded for posterity? That is a good question. A keenness to rummage through personal effects, undisturbed by their owners, was certainly a factor. Another was the knowledge that these individuals never had the chance to tell their stories outside of the confines of the psychiatry. What might be revealed by comparing the personal artifacts from the pre-institutional lives with the way they were perceived by doctors and hospital staff, regardless of what might have troubled them. We were struck by the sundering of who they were as people from who they became as mental patients. Psychiatry in those days, and still today, was largely in the business of stripping patients of their identities. Diagnostic categories serve mainly to pitch people into few pigeonholes that help psychiatrists talk about them among themselves. This is not to say that nothing was ailing the people whose stories are featured here. Beyond their obvious physical complaints, they were sad, downtrodden, heartbroken, confused, distressed, angry, irritated, and irritatingly fearful, convinced of being persecuted, troubled by voices of unseen speakers, soothed by visions of celestial kind, shaken by religious fevers, in pain from loneliness, isolation, excessive excitement, and misguided love. Each one of them could be assigned one label or another, but none of these labels, schizophrenia, dementia, melancholia, paranoia, manic depression, delusional disorder, speaks to the narratives of their lives or gives color to their own unmistakable forms of suffering. Neither could these diagnostic categories, then or now, provide a basis for successful treatment and recovery. If anything, they stand in the way of healing paths to which are suggested by the individual narratives. It is sad. If someone had taken the time and effort to piece together these people's stories during their lifetimes, a deeper understanding of their life circumstances might have led to a successful resumption of the lives they led before being institutionalized. Clearly, even with the best efforts, some people remain trapped in a web of misperception, fear, and self-loathing. Some of the suitcase owners might have remained forever distressed and unable to fully engage in society, even if they had been afforded the best treatment. But then again, even they would certainly have done better if they had been treated with kindness and persistent care and been given a chance to live in the outside world. This is sad as hell. All right, now we're on chapter 1. It's titled "He Took Them on Their Last Walk," and it has a photo of a oh, this must be Mr. Merrick. So that's one of the patients. For more than 30 years, a small man wearing heavy rubber boots strode around Willard State Hospital with a self-contained air and a general sense of industriousness. He was a well-known personage among the staff and patients. He expected to get his way, and according to some workers who knew him, he usually did. A former director of nursing at Willard said he had a seniority over the employees, the patients, and everybody else. The retired nurse called him an established member of the hospital. He wasn't the superintendent or a member of the medical staff. He was Lawrence Merrick, a patient and the institution's unpaid gravedigger until the day he died at 90 years of age. Like that? That's my phone. Yeah, I'm trying to turn it off. From 1937 until his death in 1968, Mr. Merrick worked nearly every day in the patient cemetery in every kind of weather, digging graves by hand and maintaining the expansive grounds overlooking the Seneca Lake. Halfway up the gently rising slope of the 38th burial ground, he built himself a simple wooden shack where he stayed during the warmer months of the year. That's kind of cool. Yeah, it's a not a ringtone. It's every time I get a message, I get that. It's annoying, I know. A physician noted in his record that Mark is happy, has found a home at the hospital. Perhaps that overstates the case, but certainly Lawrence figured out a way to make the best of the bad circumstances in which he found himself. And he built a life of sorts for himself while institutionalized for 52 years. If he was capable of building himself a house, grave digging, all that, why was he in here exactly? While institutionalized for 52 years, unlike most of the suitcase owners, Merrick was able to find a sense of purpose within the restricted world of the hospital, a job that he took seriously and around which he built his identity, gaining a measure of local prestige and personal satisfaction. January 19th, 1965. Patient continues to be the well-liked, hard-working, quite original old man, walking with his 87 years in rain or snow every day to do his job in the cemetery. He is always very pleasant and friendly, and possibly because of the luggage difficulties mainly, not associating with others. He is always cheerful, playing his harmonica, however, mostly for himself in his shanty. Physically, the patient is in excellent health for his age. Blood pressure 120/60. Medication none. Adolf Hug, MD. Hey, that high guy. Yeah, maybe he had alpha. Well, he's not on any medication at all. I don't know. It's so weird. Lawrence, by all accounts, was a master of his trade. I remember that he could dig a grave that was almost perfectly. As a matter of fact, it looked like it was perfectly rectangular. Former nursing director Laverne Dratt recalled. I know that he had a wooden form that he laid down on top so that he got it started, but I don't have any idea how he could possibly dig a hole in the ground 6 feet deep that was perfect. He used to wear hip waders when he was digging the grave, often because while he was digging, the water was seeping in. And when he wasn't digging graves, he also wore his hip waders. Waters? I'm not sure. He was meticulous, according to another former nursing director. Webb Rankin. I remember going over and seeing the grave and being impressed by his attention to the details of the burial and the fact that the cemetery was well maintained. He was very fussy about it. His cemetery had to be properly maintained, and he saw to it that it was maintained. Lawrence also made some pocket money by wrapping the bodies of his deceased fellow patients, according to Dratt. Lawrence also made some pocket money by wrapping the bodies of his deceased fellow patients. Preparing bodies for burial was the responsibility of the ward attendants, but they often avoided this unpleasant task by paying Merrick $1 or two to relieve them of this burden. Hey, Dragon. By taking on such grim but vital work that no one else wanted to do, Lawrence made himself indispensable to the hospital, which allowed him to take some liberties within the institutional regimen. He didn't countenance any direction from other people. If the boss told him something, then he would, but if he were just a regular employee, he just kind of went his own way, Laverne Dratt said. His behavior, one doctor noted somewhat cryptically, in the record, was not in complete agreement with the rules without causing any major difficulties. Among the rules, Lawrence stretched with the strict policy that patients would be served only at regular meal times. He used to go to the main kitchen. He was a patient. He had special privileges. And the kitchen staff would feed him pretty much regardless of what time of day it was, according to Dratt. Again, so why the hell is he in here? I hope they tell us. A self-sufficient enclave. From its founding in 1869, under the latter part of the 20th century, Willard, like other state-run mental institutions, was dependent upon unpaid patient labor to sustain its operations. The facility had over 600 acres of farmland with a greenhouse, a dairy, stables, chicken houses, piggeries, and barns, where nearly all of the facility's food was raised and processed. There were industrial shops producing clothing and shoes, baskets and brooms, and other necessities such as soap, as well as huge laundries, bakeries, and kitchens. The hospital had a slaughterhouse, woodworking shops, brickworks, a blacksmith shop, and a coal-fired power plant whose boilers were fed by patients hauling coal by wheelbarrow from the hospital's rail yard. Well, no wonder they didn't want any of them to get better. They worked for them for free. The facilities were overseen by paid staff, that most of the work was done by the patients, who also labored on the grounds crews, did the excavation for new construction, cleaned the wards and offices, served the food, and staffed the opulent home of the superintendent. In addition to Lawrence's work digging graves and tending the cemetery, patient laborers built the pine caskets and forged the number cast iron grave markers used in lieu of gravestones. No, it's apparently no, I just started reading it tonight, Patty. No, apparently this is an insane asylum. That's what I'm saying. This guy sounds like he doesn't need to be in one at all. This resilience on unpaid patient labor grew out of the philosophy that underlay the rapid expansion of state lunatic asylums in America in latter half the 19th century, called moral treatment. This practice was developed by English Quakers in response to horrific conditions in overcrowded British madhouses during the Industrial Revolution. It was based on the belief that people newly diagnosed as mad could be cured by a firm but humane hand, a safe haven from the stresses of urban life, regular work, and rigorous instruction in small country asylums. That does kind of sound a lot better than what Ali Bly went through. Importing moral treatment across the Atlantic resulted in certain American innovations that undermined the British Quakers' vision of small Bullock bucolic retreats where people would recover through nature, work, and education. American institutions were built to accommodate thousands of patients, keeping the focus on labor. These asylums were designed as small cities with ample work for asylum inmates. Besides being seen as central to recovery, patient work was necessary for these huge institutions to sustain themselves without an excessive burden on taxpayers. This is fucking annoying. Large numbers of unpaid patient workers were particularly crucial at Willard, which was founded at the urging of one Dr. John Chapin for the express purpose of providing a final resting stop for incurables. Chapin won the argument for such a massive facility by promising that it would be run far more cheaply than New York State's first asylum for acute cases at Utica because it would rely more heavily on patient labor while curtailing the creature comforts afforded to those hopeless patients. Yeah, what's the catch? I'm wondering if they're slave driving them here. Chapin was true to his word. During the years he managed Willard, the annual per patient cost was only a third of that at Utica. For more than 100 years, Willard remained nearly self-sufficient, sustained by the labor of its mostly unwilling charges. When unpaid patient labor was finally outlawed in New York in 1973, after more than a century of exploitation, this became a major factor in the exodus of patients from state hospitals that became known as deinstitutionalization. Without free labor, these huge institutions were simply unworkable. Like many of those fellow patients who were good workers, Lawrence's industriousness made him so valuable to the institution that he kept there long after he stopped experiencing any significant emotional distress. Oh, I could go for White Russian. I love those. And a margarita. Ooh, some tequila rose. All right, this one's called Hearing the Angels. The long and serpentine journey by which Lawrence Merrick came to be an irreplaceable worker at Willard began in the village of Strelza, Worka, in Austro-Hungarian Galicia, where he was born in 1878. Galicia was a remote and rural part of the empire. His father died when Lawrence was young, leaving his mother with 5 children to raise alone, and the family was dirt poor. Lawrence went to school for only 3 or 4 years. As a young man, he escaped the abject poverty by becoming a licensed itinerant tinker, collecting scrap and repairing metal objects throughout Austria and Germany. About 1900, 3 events irrevocably changed Merrick's life. He received a head injury from a stone throw, who began drinking heavily, and he was admitted to the Grafenberg Asylum near Dusseldorf, Germany, for singing, whistling, and being generally noisy. Can you imagine? Because you're noisy, you have to go in an insane asylum? Alcohol was the precipitant for his behavior, which culminated in loud accusations against himself for having sinned, prostrating himself in an attitude of prayer. His first stay in an asylum lasted less than a year. In 1902, he joined the Kaiser's army, but no information was found about the nature of length of his service. In 1907, at the age of 29, Lawrence immigrated to the United States, embarking from Hamburg on the Kaiser Augusta Victoria. He passed through Ellis Island in spite of his mental health history and found work as a porter at the New York Tribune building on Park Row. Later, he worked as a window washer at Bellevue Hospital, where he lived in a dormitory for single male workers. Little is documented about Merrick's life in New York before his 1916 admission to the psychiatric unit of Bellevue Hospital. Ironically, his place of employment became his downfall. During his admission interview, he told the doctor that he had taken classes at night school, but revealed little other information. His calfskin valise bearing the initials LM held few clues about his former life. His suitcase was brown leather, soiled and deteriorating, leather handle, metal clasp closure. His shoes, 1 pair of men's black leather dress shoes, 3-button closure flap. Mug shaving, blue with black trim, blue side handle, mug shaving, white, bottom stamped in green print, Chester Hotel China. Brush, shaving, black knob handle with metal shaft, bristles are yellowish and brittle. Brush, shaving, wood handle, metal shaft, broken, bristles are yellowish and brittle. Suspenders, heavy white elastic soiled button attachments. Wow. The record shows that after 11 apparently uneventful years as a cleaner and window washer in Manhattan, Lawrence caused a ruckus in the workers' dormitory at Bellevue, singing and shouting and whistling in a boisterous manner. He was taken across the street to the hospital's alcoholic ward and was transferred 6 days later to the psychiatric department. Chart entries state that he was confused, depressed, had self-accusatory ideas, and continually assumed attitudes of prayer, and that he must be urged to take nourishment, sleeps very poorly, requires medication, and at times, restraint is very destructive and mischievous. At times, he is flighty and elated, again depressed and emotional. From Bellevue, Merrick was quickly sent to Central Islip State Hospital on Long Island, where the examining physician found that he has, for an undetermined period of time, been hearing the voice of God and seeing visions of angels and other heavenly personages. He has numerous self-condemnatory ideas. You're very loud. Oh, of course you would say that. Excerpts from Mental Status Exam conducted by Dr. H. Elkins, July 31st, 1916. Dr. H. Elkins, how do you feel now? Lawrence says, thank you, pretty good. Do you feel happy? Yes. Why do you feel so happy? God makes me so happy. Did you ever see God? Sure. What does he look like? I can't explain. Where do you see God? In the church, any place. God is all over. God is talking to me now. What does God say to you? Tell me not to do nothing wrong. You don't always feel so happy. Sometimes you feel downhearted. It can't be helped, he says. What makes you downhearted? I done a whole lot of wrong things. Doctor, what did you do? I'm ashamed to tell you. Doctor, what did you do? I was a liar the whole of my life. Doctor, what else? I killed flies. I didn't know it was a sin, but it is. Aw. Doctor, is that a crime to kill flies? Yes. God says not to kill anything. Doctor, you were sick once before? I was in Germany. Doctor, what was the matter with you in Germany? I was crazy. And he smiled. Doctor, you were crazy at that time? I really was. Doctor, but not now. No, I'm not crazy now. Doctor, your head is nice and clear? Yes, sir. Doctor, do you sleep all right? I do. Doctor says, have any dreams now? I heard a nice song the last time. Doctor says, who sang the song? He said, the angels. Doctor, did you see the angels? No, I heard their voices. Lawrence Merrick appears to have been struggling with religious guilt and spiritual turmoil. Yet nowhere in his medical records is there any sign that doctors took his expressions of spiritual anguish seriously or tried to determine the cause of his distress. His statements were attributed to hallucinations and their content dismissed as the ramblings of a madman. Neither his old head injury nor his alcohol history figured into the doctor's diagnosis or treatment. Throughout his 2 years at Central Islip, his behavior was somewhat erratic. Within 2 months of admission, he was described as quiet and tractable. Has shown considerable improvement. He is anxious for his release, but a few weeks later, his behavior was reported as disruptive. September 23rd, 1916. This noon in the dining room, this patient suddenly became excited. He jumped up from his seat, threw over his chair, cleaned off the table, throwing the dishes around the room, and it required the efforts of several attendants to restrain him, owing to his excited condition. By September of that year, he again, holy fuck, I turned the volume down so many times. What do I need to do here? Is that it? Jesus. By December of that year, he again showed considerable improvement and requested to be sent back to New York where he can get work and has several friends who will assist him to get employment. But his request for release was not granted. His condition continued to improve after he joined the grounds crew. July 10th, 1917. This patient has been employed for the past few months in outdoor work around the lawns and grounds and has improved considerable as a result of the outdoor exercise. He is also much pleasanter and tractable. While in the ward, he sits quietly in one place and has little to say to anyone. In May 1918, Lawrence Merrick was transferred to Willard, but he was getting better. One of the party of 25 men and 30 women accompanied by attendants and Dr. Elkins, most likely, these people were transferred to make room for others in the overcrowded institutions in New York City. For several years after he arrived at Willard, Lawrence tended to be volatile and occasionally attacked other patients when they bothered him. Otherwise, he was very reclusive. His condition was generally described as dull and morose or unsocial, inclined to be uncommunicative. For the first 12 years he was there, he stayed on the ward much of the time, sometimes doing a bit of cleaning, but keeping mostly to himself. Reinventing himself through work. Throughout Merrick's 50 years at Willard, his broken English and heavy accent often made conversation difficult. By the early 1930s, though, it became clear that he enjoyed physical labor and worked best when left to his own devices. In 1932, he became a cleaner in the superintendent's house, where he was observed talking to imaginary voices, which he calls devils. A few weeks later, the record noted that he was a good ward worker, and goes out to do light work at different places about the institution. At present, is out picking peas. Over the next few years, he labored with the ground crew, did painting and repairs and was generally an industrious worker who preferred to spend his leisure time alone. During the 1930s, his religious concerns and any psychiatric symptoms were rarely mentioned in the record. By 1937, Merrick had taken full responsibility for the great patient graveyard. He seemed to thrive on the work of caring for the cemetery. Some years later, when his only coat was stolen, he sent this letter to Superintendent Dr. Kenneth Keel. I'm going to try and read it, but I don't think I can. You'll take 4. This is dated October 19th, 1945. Dr. Heel, I hereby, Lawrence, stop work yesterday afternoon. I ask you as to discharge me from yard institution. I am capable to do my living independent. I want also to just to get money for my work here. I make over 8 years more than 5 something. Prove myself and another heavy work all year around. Latch doctor to for he wants his trunk, which I thought it's in your own thought. It's deliberately that they won't give him his trunk, apparently. The letter was placed in his file to document what his doctors felt were irrational ideas. Dr. Keel did not respond to that letter, and Lawrence continued his work for another 23 years, apparently showing few signs of psychiatric problems. His medical record during that time tells a fairly consistent story. So if that's the case, why the hell didn't they let him out? April 18th, 1951. Patient continues to work as the gravedigger on the cemetery. He is a bony, elderly man, still robust and in good physical health. He is quiet about the ward and rather seclusive. He digged over 900 graves in 14 years, he said, and likes to be by himself. Dr. M. Jacometz. August 10th, 1955. The 77-year-old white male patient is careless of his appearance but clean in his habits. He does not believe he is or ever was mentally ill. On the ward, the patient is rather seclusive. He has a parole card and works in the graveyard. He may be hallucinated, but not to a marked degree. The patient is a well-developed and nourished white male who appears much younger than his actual age. Dr. Waxman. January 16th, 1961. Good health, fairly tidy, cooperative, relevant, logical, well-oriented, good worker, memory fairly good, judgment and insight fair. This is an elderly patient who is in good physical health. He is hard of hearing but works well. He doesn't consider himself mentally ill and denied hallucinations or delusions. He is fully oriented and gives good information about his life. He talks pleasantly and could carry on a conversation. Another doctor, Dr. Gungor. From the time he was 50 years old, and possibly even earlier, Lawrence rarely expressed any emotional distress. The religious guilt and turmoil he felt when he first entered the hospital apparently dissipated. Perhaps he worked out his spiritual issues on his own, or maybe these concerns became secondary to the practical matters of survival in an institution. When new epileptic drugs were first introduced to state mental hospitals in 1954, most patients were heavily medicated. Merrick was not, and there was no indication that he received any psychiatric drugs during the rest of his life. Yet the issue of his release from Willard was not even broached in the medical record until he was in his mid-80s. That's what I was wondering. Why the hell is he there still? November 18th, 1963. This 85-year-old patient is an excellent worker in the cemetery. Oh my God, he's still working at 85? He has just grown old in this hospital. He has a heavy accent and therefore may be hard to understand at times. He, however, is fully oriented. He has no delusional trends and denies sense deceptions. He shows no psychopathological whatsoever, and after 47 years of hospitalization, seems to have no other chance but to remain in the hospital, and he actually does like it. General health is good. Medication, none. By Dr. Hug. Dr. Hug. Oh, he died, didn't he? Dr. Hugg's note documents what should have been obvious to the staff at Willard for decades. There was no valid reason to keep Lawrence Merrick in a mental institution for more than two-thirds of his life. I agree. Like, how do you get around that one? I love ice wine. Have you guys ever had that? It's like juice. It's so good and gets you so drunk. It seems ironic that his work, the one thing that gave him a sense of purpose during his years as a patient, was probably the main reason he remained at Willard for 50 years. Yeah, because they didn't pay him. October 16th, 1968. Progress report. This 90-year-old patient has been in the hospital since 1918. Holy shit. And had been treated for schizophrenia, paranoid type. He had adjusted himself well to the hospital routine. He is cooperative and friendly to nursing staff. He still makes a daily trip to the cemetery where he has worked for years. His physical condition appears to be satisfactory in his advanced age. He eats and sleeps well. Patient does not require any medication still. This doctor is called Kwang Sihu. 2 weeks after this note was written, Lawrence Merrick died quietly in his sleep and was buried in an anonymous numbered grave in the cemetery that he tended so dependently for years. That's cruel. Exactly, Dad. He's labeled 102 by this tree. I'll put them in the community tab. State hospital cemeteries today. A focal point for advocacy. By diligently preparing and maintaining the final resting places of his fellow patients, Mr. Merrick was something of a pioneer. Across the United States, hundreds of thousands of state hospital patients were buried in anonymous, numbered graves during the 19th and 20th centuries. These cemeteries are concrete reminders of the way patients were treated in death as well as life. In some cases, they were buried only in shrouds, with no coffins or grave markers. In others, they were buried in pine boxes with small numbered markers. Some were cremated, their ashes left in cans in storage sheds. The patient's remains were treated with the same lack of recognition and dignity that was their lot while they lived. Like the Willard suitcase owners, many spent decades in institutions segregated from their communities, and they died there and were buried on the grounds forgotten. Today, restoration of neglected state hospital cemeteries has become a focus of advocacy by former psychiatric patients and their allies. Wow. Who want to restore dignity to the memories of those buried there and to call attention to the still rampant prejudice and discrimination against people with psychiatric histories. In 1997, ex-patient activist Patricia Deegan discovered a densely overgrown field full of numbered markers while walking her dog on the grounds of the now closed Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. Realizing that she had stumbled upon patient graves, she was shocked by the fact that the graves bore no names and that cemetery was not even minimally maintained. She photographed the markers and their neglected surroundings, began searching for cemetery records, and helped other ex-patients organize to demand that the Commonwealth restore the graves. If people treat a cemetery like trash, it's a good indication of how they feel about the buried people there and those who are still receiving services, she said. At meetings and conferences, Pat shared the existence of the Danvers cemeteries with other ex-patients around the country, inspiring them to find and restore abandoned burial grounds on their own communities. It turned out that there were hundreds of neglected state hospital cemeteries across the country, and many burial records were lost, incomplete, or declared off limits because of confidentiality concerns. Only a handful of graves have headstones with the names of the deceased. Some of these mark the graves of veterans, whose stones were paid for by the armed forces, while others were placed by family members. But most graves are marked only with numbers, if at all, and many of the markers were primitive. Some graves are marked by 3-inch ceramic discs into which a number had been scratched. Others by small granite squares. At Harlem Valley State Hospital in New York, hand-cut tin numbers were pressed into cement-filled coffee cans, while at Rockland State Hospital, numbered plates were fastened to cinder blocks. At New York's Kings Park State Hospital, a 4-acre plot contains more than 1,000 unmarked graves of 19th-century patients, their only identification, numbers written on slips of paper and put into glass bottles buried next to the shrouded bodies. That's horrible. Conditions such as these resulted in dozens of cemetery restoration projects being organized in at least 20 states. Those of ex-patients and their allies became amateur historians, genealogists, and landscapers working to identify unmarked graves and restore the cemetery grounds. Some state mental authorities assisted the efforts with money or labor. A high-ranking mental health official in Georgia made a stirring public apology for the neglect of the cemeteries and for the continued neglect and abuse of patients. Ex-patient found that local civic group churches with historical societies were often willing to join the restoration efforts. Working side by side with people who may never have knowingly met a former mental patient before, it became clear to ex-patients that the cemetery restoration effort served two purposes. It respectfully memorialized the long-forgotten patients who were buried anonymously, and it helped community members change some of their negative stereotypes about people with psychiatric histories. Pat Deegan explains the impact of the cemetery restoration efforts this way. Cemetery restoration gave ex-patients and other activists a chance to take the moral high ground. We were seen as people who are able to make a positive contribution. I would love to help in that, wouldn't you guys? I bet you there's lots here in Ontario. We were seen as people who were able to make a positive contribution, and as the effort caught on, it became a leadership development tool. As ex-patients learned how to organize the deal with the press, finally, it gave many people a chance to grieve over what had happened to them. It's sad. Often their memories were so painful that they had never gone back to the state hospitals in which they had been housed. At Willard, conditions at the cemetery slowly declined after Lawrence Merrick's death in 1968. A small death benefit was made available to Medicare recipients, and more patients were buried in community cemeteries while fewer were interred in the hospital cemetery, except for the section containing the named stones of Civil War veterans who lived and died at Willard. Graves were indicated by numbers or rectangular cast iron markers. The cemetery, which contains 5,776 graves, has its first burial in 1870, one after the hospital opened. The last burial in June 2000 and was that of a former patient who died in a nursing home and asked to be buried at Willard. During Lawrence's lifetime, roads were maintained throughout the cemetery, clearly distinguishing the separate sections set aside for people of various faiths. A map and index were available to locate a specific grave when family and friends came looking for their loved one's burial site. But sometimes, in the 1980s, the cast iron markers were removed to make mowing and maintenance easier. Just, I don't know, I would say just bring awareness that there is people buried in spots where nobody even knew that they meant something to people. It's people's loved ones, and that their markers shouldn't be removed because they need to mow and stupid shit like that. So in the 80s, the cast iron markers were removed to make mowing and maintenance easier, and most of the markers were tossed into the gully behind the cemetery hill. The roads were no longer kept up, and Lawrence Merrick's meticulously manicured cemetery began to vanish. Willard's graveyard was not one of those that benefited from a restoration effort in recent years, and today it resembles a pasture. Willard Cemetery in 1960, and this one, you can tell the difference. Holy crap. It's well taken care of. In the bottom, it's not. So there's the well taken care of one, and this is the 80s. It's just crap. Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah. Chapter 2. Who went to Willard, and why did they go there? On October 13th, 1869, a steamboat docked at Ovid Landing on the eastern shore of Seneca Lake, and several men led a deformed woman down the gangplank. Mary wrote, Willard's first patient had been chained for 10 years without a bed or clothing in a cell in the Columbia County Alms House, 250 miles downriver. What the shit? It's the Willard Cemetery in New York. Three more patients. Men arrived at the dock that day, all in irons. One in what looked like a chicken crate. Oh my God. 3.5 feet square. By the end of 1870, the new institution housed 125 men and 450 women. Many of Willard's early patients have been considered too difficult in respective poorhouses and have been subjected to regular floggings, dousing, and pulleying, hanging by the thumbs in attempts to quiet them. Oh my God. Hanging by your thumbs? I can't imagine that. The new asylum was founded as a destination for anyone considered incurably mad who was being held under less than ideal circumstances. America had woken up to the reality that people deemed mad were increasingly taking up space in poorhouses, jails, and cellars, and might be better served in a different kind of asylum. Following in the footsteps of French and British doctors like Philippe Pinel and William Tux, who separated the mad from the lumpen proletariat nearly 50 years earlier. American physicians like Sylvester Ward, for whom the institution was named, advocated for facilities that would serve precisely this purpose. Unlike other state institutions that were set up to provide acute care to individuals from the surrounding communities, for its first 25 years, Willard received only patients from across the state who had already exhausted the public resources of their countries. Even paupers did not want to witness people kept in tiny cells and iron locks, being fed through opening in their doors, never let out until their limbs were crippled. Oh my God, this is fucking horrible. Unlike the other state institutions were set up to provide acute care to individuals from the surrounding communities, for its first 25 years, Willard received only patients from across the state who had already exhausted the public resources of their countries. I think I just read that. Yep. Women were regularly abused by all comers, and the whole business had turned into a matter of public disgrace. Much better, it was reasoned, to ship people as far away as possible, sequestering them in a bucolic setting. There, they could be provided with an environment that was morally sound and designed to treat its charges through strict but caring attitudes of their new keepers, under the guidance of medical personnel. But a selection took place even among the residents of the poorhouses, since no one wanted to lose a worker who could be of help to their operation. Mary Rowe died of tuberculosis a few years after she arrived, but by 1877, Willard was filled with 1,550 people from all over the state. Nearly everyone who was admitted in the early days arrived by boat and left by hearse. Wow. Seneca Lake was a virtual river, but life inside the confines of Willard was said to be much improved compared to where its inmates came from. By the time Willard was converted from an asylum for the insane into a state hospital in 1980, the railroad had replaced steamboat traffic, making the transfer of patients much more efficient. Being classified as a state hospital meant that Willard was now open to both acute and chronic cases from the surrounding 11 countries, but continued to receive the hopeless from other parts of the state as well. Before 1890, only individuals whose families or countries were willing to pay ended up in the state asylum. After 1890, the state assumed the costs. There's so much in here. Holy crap. I will, what is today? Wednesday? I'll just do this every Wednesday. How about that? There's a photo down here of an older woman. Her name is Josine Smith, and wrote on it is the number 486. Just a very small corner here. All right, I will take photos and I'll put them in the community tab so you guys can see them. Then I gotta help my kid with some homework. And I gotta finish painting too. Oh, absolutely, Patty. 100%. 100%. Because they were left there to essentially die. Homework film. You know what I mean? Yeah, I should help him. I've seen some papers that he's trying to hide from me. All right, I'll be back tomorrow at 7 with Jack the Ripper. You guys have a great night, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye.